do it has been prohibited. Of course, that's a rather narrow range of jobs, but they're important jobs. Lots of users want to play DVDs. Lots of users want to listen to a real audio stream or a real video stream. And free software to do that is prohibited as well. So these problems are a major obstacle to liberating the rest of the users. Of course, that law in the U.S. doesn't affect people in other countries, but the U.S. is trying its best to impose such laws on other countries, often doing so through trade negotiations. The U.S. was trying to impose that very restriction on the entire Western Hemisphere through the free trade area of the Americas, but it was blocked by Brazil, a country where the government now gives strong support to free software. The other law that the U.S. has, which prohibits many different kinds of free software, is applying patent law to software ideas. Now, it's important to recognize that this is not a matter of patenting programs, because each patent covers an idea, and each program combines many different ideas to do a job. Writing a substantial program inevitably means you use lots of ideas which then are embodied in the code of the program. Some of them you may not even have been aware of. You may not have noticed that these 20 lines of code embody a certain idea. You just wrote them. But if somebody has a patent saying nobody's allowed to implement that idea, you can still get sued for having written those 20 lines. I think the record for shortness of a program that would get you sued is 3 lines on the PDP-10 way back when. 3 lines of code was enough to do something that was patented, and you could get sued for it. Of course, those 3 lines in your program would be together with maybe 100,000 other lines, which might implement 200 other different patented ideas, and you might get sued 200 times by 200 different people. So software patents, as it happens, are not just bad for free software. They're bad for all software developers. It's a terrible, stupid policy. It makes software development like crossing a minefield, because at each design decision, there's a certain chance you'll step on a patent, and you never know when it's going to happen. But when it does happen, it can explode and destroy your project. So it's important to make sure that your country doesn't have software patents, that it does not follow the mistake of the U.S. Now, the impact of software patents on the free software community is that there are various programs we don't have and can't have, at least not in the U.S. and not in those other countries that allow such patents. And this can affect any kind of software. For any kind of job, this problem can occur. And the danger is that users who haven't been taught to value freedom, when they choose what software to use, if they choose solely based on the immediate practical benefits, they will look at free software and say, this is bad, it doesn't have this feature. And why don't we have the feature? Because the government said we're not allowed to have the feature. But the users don't think of it that way. They just say, the free software is inferior, I'm going to choose to be a slave. So part of resisting this problem is teaching users to recognize that freedom itself is something that they need. But part of it is organizing politically to make sure that as many countries as possible reject patenting software ideas. Why make software development like a minefield? Developing software is hard enough. There's no need to make it even harder by saying there are all these things you have to avoid doing. So these are 2 of the dangers that we face, of the forms of opposition that we face. In addition, there is the problem that some hardware has secret specifications. There are companies that will sell you a piece of hardware that you could use in your PC, but they won't tell you how to run it. The specifications are secret. Instead, they offer you a non-free program to run that hardware with. Well, if you don't mind giving up your freedom, that solves the problem, right? But if you do value your freedom, that's not acceptable at all. But it's hard to write free software to replace those non-free drivers if we can't figure out how to talk to the hardware. So it's a hard job, which often involves, watching the signals that go back and forth to the hardware in order to figure out the right commands to use. So what we need to do is to organize and put pressure on these hardware companies to say that you're not really supporting our community if you invite us to use a non-free program. So start really cooperating with us. We're not asking you to write the program. Just publish the specifications of your hardware. We'll write the program. We'll support it. We'll be completely satisfied if you just publish the specs, or just even show us the specs. Let us look at them and write the free program. As long as you let us write the program, then that's enough cooperation. That's all we ask of you. And sometimes we convince one, but there are still some who refuse to cooperate. But the biggest threat we face is from treacherous computing. That's the name we call it. The proponents of this scheme call it trusted computing. This is a conspiracy of many large corporations who aim to impose a change in the design of all computers. I say it's a conspiracy. You might wonder how I know. The answer is it's not a secret. They admit it. You can go look it up and see that companies such as Intel and AMD and IBM and Hewlett-Packard and Sun and Microsoft and Transmeta have all agreed to participate in this plan, which they call trusted computing. But that name is deceptive. What do they mean? They mean that an application developer can trust your computer to obey him and not you. So from your point of view, it's treacherous computing, because it means your computer will not obey you. And that's the whole point. This redesign of all computers is intended to give the software developers more control and give you less control. But it's not being done as a proposed law, although they do take advantage of the laws in some countries that make it illegal to bypass the scheme. What they intend is simply to get all the computer manufacturers to participate in this scheme, or most of them at least, and then they expect to publish data in formats that can only be accessed using the special treacherous computing hardware. And then for instance, they expect to publish music and movies that way and books. And so then they figure that the users will all say, I want treacherous computing. I want my computer to betray me so that I can access these published works. And that way they figure that people would still be allowed to make computers that don't do this, but nobody will. And yes, we will still be allowed to develop free operating systems, but it will be impossible on a free operating system to access any of those publications. So the idea is that free software will appear so inadequate that it will die. Now, how are we going to resist this? I'm hoping that some governments will actively sponsor the development of hardware that bypasses, that defeats the plot, and make this available fairly cheaply to the public. So if a government supports us strongly enough in rejecting treacherous computing, that method can be used. I also hope that governments will require that anyone who sells treacherous computing hardware will actually give the user full control over it, which will defeat the purpose. Because the point of treacherous computing is that it doesn't fully give the user control over what the hardware is going to do.